Cuba program, I want to welcome our listeners, as well as our panelists and moderators, as well as our interpreters, to the second half of the conference on Cuba and environmental cooperation. This afternoon, we're going to focus largely on recommendations for the future, cooperation on environmental cooperation, as well as cooperation related to sustainability. I'm Meg Crahan, the director of the Cuba program at Columbia University. Somebody asked me in the morning, who are you? And I forgot to mention that. We have three interpreters, Vicente, Nancy, and Tomas. And our expert on technology is Gretchen Sanchez, who is the program assistant of the Cuba program at Columbia University. The moderators, plural, for this afternoon's session will be David Ferrer from the American College of Environmental Lawyers and Yociel Marerro from the Fundación Antonio Nuñez Jiménez, who will moderate the session concerning recommendations for the future. So we're all set and ready to go. And I am going to turn it over to David Ferrer, but not before I mention that if you want to pose a question in the panelist presentation, please use the Q&A room, not the chat room. That's the Q&A, questions and answers, rather than the chat room. Thank you. David?
Meg, thanks. And welcome everyone to the second session on today's webinar on reinvigorating and expanding US-Cuba environmental cooperation. As Meg said, I'm David Ferrer. I'm going to be moderating until I turn the proceedings over to my friend Yociel Marerro of the Foundation, Antonio Nuñez Jiménez, FANJ, as I'll be referring to them, to handle the concluding portion. I'm a career-long environmental lawyer. I've written and taught on environmental issues throughout my career. I chair the environmental group with a law firm, Greenbaum Rowe, in New Jersey and New York in the US. My practice has focused most centrally on acquisition and cleanup and redevelopment of highly contaminated properties, commonly referred to in the environmental field as brownfields. I'm a past president of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, which I will refer to by its acronym for the rest of the afternoon, ACOEL. Since then, though, I've been a co-chair of the college's International Pro Bono Committee and leading the Cuba Working Group. ACOEL is a nonprofit professional association of highly experienced environmental lawyers from around the country, practicing in many specialties, chosen by our colleagues to join the organization based on substantial and recognized careers in private practice, in academia, in government, or in NGOs. Of the 20,000 or so environmental lawyers around the country, less than 300 are chosen as members in our college. So we're basically talking about the top 1% of practitioners, a handful of lawyers from each of the states. Dan Whittle, who did a great job moderating this morning's program, is a fellow of the college, we're happy to say, as are two of this afternoon's panelists. And the reason I'm talking about the college at this length is that one of the central goals of the group is to give back by way of providing pro bono services, both in the United States and internationally. We've worked cooperatively with local partners in the US and around the world to provide free services by our group of lawyers. We facilitate the provision of pro bono services by entering into memorandums of understanding. You heard a lot about MOUs this morning. We enter MOUs with particular governmental agencies or not-for-profit groups. Our group and the government or the agency or the organization then discuss the extent to which the group or the government requests the environmental services from our group of lawyers. Then we put specific lawyers from our organization directly in touch with the agency or group. The group or agency selects who they'd like to work with. And again, then those services are provided free of charge. Our efforts in Cuba led to the college entering an MOU in 2019 with FANG, the foundation that is a co-sponsor here. And I was delighted to have the privilege of representing the college at the signing of that MOU in Havana in 2019 when Liliana Nuñez and I executed the document. That led to the planning of a joint symposium I mentioned this morning with FANG that had been scheduled for last March on topics learned, lessons learned, I should say, in environmental law. Where do we go from here on collaborations when COVID disrupted all of our worlds? Since then, we have nonetheless looked for ways to work and collaborate together. And the college and FANG are very grateful that with our two other co-sponsors today, Columbia University and the Environmental Defense Fund, we've been able to move forward here. And I do want to take a moment right now to express particular gratitude, Meg, to you and to Gretchen of Columbia's Cuba program within ILAS at Columbia, not only for your support and planning, but also for facilitating Columbia's very substantial administrative and financial and technical commitment in producing this event. So thank you very much. All right, let's talk about what we'll do this afternoon. What I'm going to do is briefly introduce each of the panelists all together and their topics in the order of those presentations. Then we're going to spend the better part of the next hour or so on brief presentations by each presenter. That's going to be followed by discussion and reactions among the panel and addressing comments and questions from the audience that we hope you will put into the Q&A room. After that, I'll turn to Yociel, who will lead the summing up session, and then we'll have a final goodbye from everybody. So here's the panel. We've grouped them at the request of the translators into English-speaking and then Spanish-speaking presenters to help the process of the translations. So here's who we've got on our panel this afternoon. First off is going to be Pam Giblin, who's going to speak to climate change and its impact on agriculture. Pam is a senior policy advisor at the Climate Leadership Council in Austin, Texas. As we talked about this morning, eyes have been on Texas and climate over the past week. Before that, Pam led the environmental practice group at the law firm Baker Botts. She's practiced environmental law since the 1970s, has extensive experience in a broad range of issues, particularly air, water, and hazardous waste. And Pam was my immediate predecessor as president of ACOEL. After Pam, we'll hear from Hope Bastian on anthropological perspectives on US-Cuban environmental collaborations. Hope is an assistant professor at the University of Havana. She holds a PhD in anthropology from American University, and she's the author of the book, Everyday Adjustments in Havana, Economic Reforms, Mobility, and Emerging Inequalities. That's just from a couple of years ago, and that's a topic on which Hope's field research and teaching focus. Hope uses ethnography to explore impacts of economic reform and how social movements, including movements around critical issues like birth and LGBTQ+ rights and gender violence, use the new technologies for debate in Cuba's emerging virtual public sphere. And Hope's been involved in cultural exchanges between Cuba and the US since 2004. After Hope, we'll hear from Korey Silverman-Roati on renewable energy opportunities in a highly distributed Cuban electric grid. Korey is a climate law fellow right at the Sabin Center at Columbia University School of Law, a very fine center of climate law and developments. Before joining at Columbia, Korey was a law fellow at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development, where he had focused on international climate litigation, carbon dioxide removal, and solar radiation management research. And before that at Harvard Law, he spent all 3 years there editing the Harvard Environmental Law Journal. After Korey, we'll hear from Yurdanka Castillo on the benefit of executing an environmental memorandum while considering the policies of the US and Cuba. Yurdanka is a Cuban attorney and has worked as general counsel with FANG. Yurdanka recently completed an LLM from Penn State University College of Law. And I am delighted to note that the American College of Environmental Lawyers was a sponsor of Yurdanka's on her studies there. So we watched them very carefully. We're glad to see them concluded with such great success. Yurdanka has been working as an attorney for the emerging private sector in Cuba, providing legal and business advice, including on issues of social responsibility and sustainable development. In addition to that, she's also the director and co-founder of Lexa Cuba, a project focused on the Cuban market of legal tech. Following Yurdanka, we'll hear from Lee DeHines on addressing environmental issues as an element of negotiations between Cuban and foreign companies concerning joint ventures in Cuba. Lee, also a fellow in the American College of Environmental Lawyers, was formerly a member of the Environmental and Land Development Group at the law firm Alston & Bird. Lee practiced primarily on regulatory and litigation matters, including climate issues, environmental audit and compliance programs, air quality, hazardous waste, wetlands, among other things. And Lee's been very active in the major national association of lawyers known as the American Bar Association. He chaired the ABA section on environment, energy, and resources from 2007 to 2008. He was the chair of the ABA delegation to the UN Rio +20 conference in 2012 that we heard referred to earlier, and was chair of the ABA Presidential Task Force on Sustainable Development from 2013 to 2015. Then we turn to the Spanish-speaking presenters. First, Daimar Canovas. Hello, Daimar, who will be speaking on biodiversity protection as a space for Cuba-USA cooperation. Daimar is an associate professor at the University of Havana Faculty of Law. He is also a director and senior researcher at the Institute of Ecology and Systematics within Cuba's Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment. He has earned diplomas in environmental law, land management, urbanism and the environment, and public administration. He holds bachelor's and JD degrees from the University of Havana, as well as a doctorate in legal sciences from the University of Havana. And then finally this afternoon, we'll hear from Yociel Marerro on the future of US-Cuba relations, promoting environmentally responsible projects. Yociel is director of the Economics and Responsible Consumption Program at FANG. He develops strategies for socioeconomic alternatives that contribute to sustainable development within Cuban society. He holds a master's degree in integral management of eco-technologies from Humboldt State College in California. In recognition of his work on the environmental technology systems for sanitation in the Almaderas Vento Basin. Yociel received the Architecture and Engineering Award of the Cuban College of Engineers. He has advised projects in the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Argentina, and Brazil. And I don't know how he finds the time, but he also organizes music concerts and art exhibitions to further social communication among different groups and institutions. So a great group. Now on to the presentations and discussion. So Pam Giblin, may I turn to you, climate change and agriculture.
Ok, gracias. Antes de empezar mi presentación en inglés, les quiero agradecer esta oportunidad para poder compartir con ustedes nuestras ideas y recibir las ideas de ustedes. Okay, I'm going to talk about, like David said, climate change and the challenges and opportunities in the agriculture community. But before that, just some sort of background that's already been alluded to by Dan and others, that at least within the United States, and I think across the world, there's been a pivot in terms of realizing the impact of climate change. And it's real, and the debate is over, if there was ever a debate. So the scientists have pretty much done their job of laying the foundation for the need to do something about climate change. For decades, I worked on air quality issues. And climate is sort of an extension of that, because obviously greenhouse gases get emitted into the atmosphere. So there are a lot of analogs to air quality law. I want to talk a little bit about some of the initiatives that we're doing in the United States and try to see how both countries can benefit, because Cuba obviously has huge coastline, as does the US. And so the impacts of climate change are going to be felt immensely in these coastal communities. And so we're all invested, because if we don't get this right, none of the rest of it is going to matter. So I want to comment on one thing too, as far as background. For years, I advised US companies who were doing business in Latin America and companies from Latin America that were doing the business in the US. And one thing that I found is that most of Latin America has actually much more sophisticated and rigorous environmental laws than the US, which surprised a lot of American companies. They were like, what? But for example, the fact that in the constitutions of so many Latin American countries, embedded environmental protection that of course now lends itself to climate change protections, that is something we don't have. And it's great, because it sets the table for dealing with this issue in a way that, again, we in the US have a lot to learn from other countries about how you have addressed some of these things. So we're not squandering a lot of energy trying to figure out how to lay the legal groundwork. I mean, if we had it in our Constitution, we wouldn't be having to go through a lot of the fights that we're having to go through statutorily, but it is what it is. And so we're dealing with our regime the way it is, but you have the good fortune of having constitutional underpinnings that will help you as you deal with climate change. And one last thing before I get into the agriculture piece specifically. Our challenge is to take the aspirational elements of, for example, the Paris Accord and other international statements, take those aspirations and translate them into action. And that's much more difficult. You know, I'm sure everybody here has read the Paris Climate Accord. And when you read it, you know, it's got great aspirations, great language, but it doesn't have an enforcement mechanism. So going forward, we are going to have to take it to the next level and not just think that Paris and the US rejoining Paris is going to be the solution to everything. Okay, so let's talk about agriculture. Agriculture can play a big part, not just in terms of adopting practices that minimize climate change and really farming that is much more environmentally sensitive, but there are actually opportunities for carbon sequestration where agriculture can be a solution. I'm working with a group sponsored by the Baker Institute at Rice University, and they have put together this huge consortium of 100 entities, including some of the biggest agricultural interests in the US, and the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy, and just a lot. It's a very diverse group. And what they have come up with is a way to implement the sequestration of carbon in agricultural soils. And this has so much promise for a lot of reasons. One, again, it helps take carbon out of the atmosphere that's already there. So in addition to trying to get farms and other agricultural operations not to emit as much, we can actually take carbon that's already in the air and sequester it in soil. And it has the ancillary benefit of improving crop productivity. If anybody's interested in this group that's put on by, I said, the Baker Institute, headed by a man named Jim Blackburn, who's a leading environmental lawyer in the US, he would be thrilled to collaborate with Cuba in any way possible. He has visited Cuba. He sees the opportunities with a country that is so rich in agricultural resources to figure out how we can implement these policies that, as I said, don't just minimize the production of GHGs, greenhouse gas emissions, but actually reduce what's there. Because there's a lot of technology being developed that sucks carbon out of the air. And so then what do you do with it? And again, agricultural operations are a perfect repository for that. And so there are so many opportunities because, as I said, the scientists, the climate scientists have done their work. So now it's up to the technical people who could perhaps craft the solutions, the lawyers to implement the framework and to fit it into the statutory and constitutional regimes, and the politicians. The politicians, especially in the US, I think are finally waking up to the idea that this has to be dealt with. So the challenge to all of us on this call is how do we implement the opportunity so that we don't come away from Paris and other climate conferences with more words, but we translate that into action. And agriculture has a big role to play. So if anybody's interested in more information about this initiative, let me know. And I checked with them before I came on and they said, we would love to collaborate with Cuba. So that's it.
That's great. And that's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for, are means to collaborate together, ways to find projects that we can actively be doing, even if it's not getting to the very last degree, a start on all of these issues.
Right. And we can learn as much, both countries, no one country has the answers. So we can learn from you, you can learn from us, and together we can come up with a better idea. So anyway. Agreed.
When we talk about lessons learned, we have to look at ourselves.
I know.
Right? Thank you, Pam. Sure. That was great. Let's turn right to Hope Bastian on anthropological perspectives on U.S. environmental collaborations. Hope?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm here in Havana, and I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So I'm an anthropologist. So when I think of fisheries, I'm one of those weird people that doesn't think about fish. I think about people. And fisheries are as much about people as they are about fish, right? So too often when we talk about the potential loss of marine fisheries, it gets discussed as an environmental problem. But the impacts of the decline of major fish species are very real, and they're already being felt by people and communities all over the world. So as is the case with so many of these environmental problems, the impacts are unevenly distributed, and those who are hardest hit are the poor. Sheer desperation drives poor fishermen to increasingly destructive fishing methods, both to feed themselves and to supply fish for the wealthy. So this focus on people in Cuban fisheries has been a fertile space for US, Cuban, and international collaborations that were mentioned this morning, like SOS Pesca, the Research Initiative for Sustainable Development of Cuba, and many others. Many Cuban NGOs like FANJ, like the Centro Felix Varela, the Martin Luther King Center, Pro Naturaleza, and Cuban scientific associations are on the ground, and they're dealing with these issues right along with SIGMA in these communities. So in Cuba, fishing is the almost exclusive source of income in about 168 communities across the island. And since 2000, Cuban fisheries have been reported to be in critical condition. And in 2018, it was estimated that 20% of fishery resources are fully exploited. 74% are overexploited and 5% are collapsed. So Julio Baisare's article in the Bulletin of Marine Science Journal that was mentioned this morning explains that urgent action has to be taken by fisheries managers to control and reduce the fishing effort, to reestablish strict enforcement of fishery regulations, and to change damaging fishing practices in order to achieve sustainability and long-term economic solvency. And these unsustainable fishing practices are putting valuable marine resources at risk, at the same time threatening the livelihoods and food security of many families. Illegal fishing is an individual solution to a systemic problem of limited livelihood options. So the options that Cuban families find for what we can say putting beans in the pressure cooker are limited by the impacts of domestic and international policies. And the costs of tensions in US-Cuban relations over the last years are being paid by the most vulnerable communities on both sides of the Florida Straits. In Cuba today, no one is immune to the effects of the last 4 years of increasingly aggressive policies to strengthen the US embargo and to cut ties between the US and Cuban people. In Cuba in 2016, optimism, euphoria were palpable. There were strong connections being made between the US and Cuba, and officials from both countries were sitting down to take action on matters of mutual interest. Anything seemed possible, right? In Havana, there was a middle class emerging that was investing money from remittances and property sales in new small businesses. Tourists were traveling throughout the island, attracted by this beautiful, beautiful country. Ecotourism was creating new sources of employment in coastal communities. And I think many of you on this call were here in Cuba witnessing these exciting transformations. So Cuba in 2016 had multiple streams of income in tourism and medical services and remittances, offered Cuban families, both in urban and rural areas, the opportunity to combine multiple sources of livelihood for greater economic security. We fast forward to 2021, and after 4 years of deteriorating relations, economic insecurity is endemic in the midst of a pandemic. Cuba has been hit hard by US restrictions, and the economic impacts of the state's admirable commitment to protecting the health of the population from the threat of COVID. As we see in the documentary Lista Quinta by Cuban filmmaker Yociel Garcia Castro, small-scale fishing, private fishing operations in Cuba face regular difficulties in dealing with fishing regulations. In 2020, Cuba's new fishery law came into effect, addressing some of these issues and likely introducing others. Many fishing communities are concerned about licensing and the authorization processes for small-scale operations. They're the ones that they supply the state, but also local markets, and provide rural fishing communities with an important source of subsistence. Around the world, fishery management decisions have socioeconomic and health effects, and researchers have called for these community impacts to be integrated into the studies of the biological impacts of environmental protection regulations. Anthropologists and other social scientists can contribute to protecting fisheries and the livelihood of coastal fishing communities. The networks of fishers and the people who support them are all affected by the success or failure of fishing. So in addition to supporting participatory policymaking processes, social scientists can support the evaluations of the effectiveness of new laws and regulations and monitor their socioeconomic impacts over time by collecting data to measure changes in employment and income, in profit and loss, and changes in the composition of the coastal fisheries industry. So when relevant data does not exist, participant observation, in-person interviews, and surveys are important tools that we have in our toolbox. Spiny lobster is the most valuable fishery resource in Cuba, and despite strong management, the population shows signs of decline. The illegal catch is estimated at 18% of the total harvest, and these illegal hauls may include sub-legalized lobsters, females carrying eggs. There's no doubt that the free access to public health and education provided by the state to all Cubans is a very favorable element in the health of fishing communities and their development. But in order to control illegal fishing, it's necessary to identify what unmet needs might be in the community, to help understand the reasons for illegal fishing, and to create the right disincentives or incentives to control illegal capture, as well as facilitating economic alternatives to improve food security. Cuba is home to spawning grounds for commercially important snappers, and protecting fisheries and fishing communities in Cuba protects the livelihoods of fishing peoples across the region. Likewise, unsustainable fishing practices create risks for valuable marine resources and threaten local livelihoods and food security in Cuba and in the United States. So local fishing communities have much to gain from strong US-Cuban environmental collaborations to improve fisheries management while also protecting coastal communities from the economic effects of fishery decline. And despite our lack of knowledge about fish, anthropologists and social scientists are here and can be called upon to play a role in these collaborations. So thank you for letting me be part of this conversation.
That was terrific. Thank you very much, Hope. And let's come back to this because these issues are so, maybe in different ways, but are so common to both countries with the overfishing problems, with the species collapses, with restrictions that are having to be put on the fisheries. So this should be ripe for collaboration.
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Sure.
Okay, Korey, on renewable energy opportunities and a highly distributed Cuban electric grid. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. So in 2017, Michael Panfil, Daniel Whittle, who led the panel this morning, and I published a report and corresponding study on the Cuban electricity sector. So this talk draws mostly from that report and publicly available sources. So please let me know if you recognize any info that is out of date. In short, Cuba relies heavily on oil for electricity generation with associated climate and local health impacts. The electricity is generated from uniquely highly distributed sources, and the grid is one of the most distributed in the world. And what this means is that more power is generated closer to consumer. The Cuban government has set strong renewable energy goals for 2030, and the distributed grid creates unique opportunities to utilize solar energy as part of the future energy mix. Cuba relies heavily upon liquid fuels for electricity generation, and it has the 5th highest percentage of total energy derived from liquid fuels in the world. Of total electricity output in 2014, 81% was generated from fuel oil, 14% from natural gas, 3% from sugarcane biomass, and 1% from other renewables, including wind, solar, and hydro. Now, this mix is highly distributed, as I explained earlier, and Cuban leaders invested heavily in distributed generation in response to widespread damage to transmission and distribution infrastructure from hurricanes in the mid-2000s. As a result, Cuba has one of the highest percentage of distributed capacity in the world at 42%, second only to Denmark and significantly more than in the United States. This distributed capacity is made up of diesel generators, fuel oil motors, combined heat and power, and renewable energy sources. Cuba's investment in distributed generation has provided resiliency benefits, but also has some pitfalls. The system helps mitigate extreme weather-related disruptions that can lead to catastrophic events. Each distributed plant does not rely as heavily on extended transmission networks, and they can be brought online more quickly than centralized systems. However, distributed systems may be less efficient, and when sited closer to Cuban homes and communities, they can cause local pollution. Now, in 2020, Cuba submitted an updated nationally determined contribution as part of the Paris Agreement, and we heard a little bit about that this morning. The country reiterated its commitment to increase to 24% of electricity generation based on renewable sources by 2030. In the plan, electricity consumption is expected to grow by 1.6 times, and renewables are expected to grow by 6 times as a makeup of total consumption. Of this 2030 generation mix, the plan calls for biomass to make up 14% of total generation, and the total from wind, solar, and hydro to make up 10% of total generation. Now, Cuba is a country with excellent solar resources. The daily average solar energy that reaches Cuban land throughout the year is nearly twice that in Germany, a country with relatively strong solar generation. And Cuba has extensive wind resources. The country has an estimated potential of 2,500 megawatts that could be derived from wind areas suitable to utility scale applications. Now, as part of the report that I mentioned, we developed 8 recommendations, and I'm going to discuss just 3 briefly here. First, Cuban-US cooperation could help facilitate investment in solar distributed generation, which means building solar capacity at sites where the electricity demand comes from. This could either be at existing distributed generation sites in Cuba or directly around buildings throughout the island. The plan could focus first on critical infrastructure like schools and hospitals to provide added resiliency benefit. And Cuba already has experience installing solar distributed generation on these critical facilities, siting solar panels on the buildings themselves like hospitals and schools. What could be done is to massively expand this program throughout the country. Now, solar distributed generation can both mitigate near-term energy shortages and can help Cuba's long-term energy goals. First, solar can be installed rapidly. In the US, the median project completion time for a solar project is 53 days, whereas natural gas plants take 1.5 to 2 years to build, and coal plants take 3 to 6 years. Second, solar distributed generation provides power during peak working hours, and Cuba likewise experiences peak demand in summer months when solar resources are strongest. Third, solar distributed generation has the potential to be integrated into the already existing system that I talked about earlier. Now, solar distributed generation also provides comparative advantages over alternatives in meeting Cuba's longer-term energy goals. It is often a cost-competitive solution. In other island nations that have utilized solar on a wider scale, it can be one of the cheapest resources once constructed. And solar distributed generation can reduce local air pollution that might come from distributed oil systems. Finally, investing in solar distributed generation would help support that NDC goal of generating 24% of electricity from renewables by 2030. Now, another recommendation that we developed was to consider building microgrids at high consuming destinations. This is a similar concept to distributed generation. A microgrid is a local energy grid with control capability, which means it can disconnect from the traditional grid and operate autonomously. And Cuba could consider siting power in close proximity to high consuming areas of the country. Now, utilizing renewables and microgrids can lower costs, diverse resource mixes can help increase resiliency, and energy storage can be successful to helping make that microgrid work. Finally, another recommendation is to invest and collaborate with US investors on alternatives to fuel oil generation. Now, lowering the amount of electricity generated from fuel oil could be a long-term goal. It's unlikely to happen overnight because it makes up such a large part of the generation mix currently. But burning fuel oil is economically and environmentally harmful, and moving away from fuel oil generation can lead to less local air pollution, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, and lowered cost. Utility scale solar, wind, and biomass, all part of Cuba's NDC plan, could help bring these benefits to the country. That's it. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you for that. Let's come back to that issue too later. We're also going to be hearing from Lee DeHines about joint venture issues. So this may be ripe for further discussion. Well, it is obviously ripe for further discussion, but I mean today. Okay, thank you. Let's turn next to Yurdanka Castillo on the benefit of executing an environmental memorandum while considering the policies of Cuba and the US. Yurdanka.
Thank you, Davey. First, I would like to say thank you, Joanna and Liliana, Yociel, for inviting me to participate in this event on behalf of the environmental organization Antonio Nuñez Jiménez Foundation. It feels very well be part of the team and working with the team again, even from far. And I'm also delighted to participate in this panel with such a talented lawyers. I consider myself a junior still in comparison with such a great lawyers here, but I'm here. I'm gonna talk about, as David said, the benefits of executing an environmental memorandum while considering the policies of the United States and Cuba. I will briefly address some issues that in my experience practicing as an international lawyer has come multiple times when parties is negotiating an agreement. A memorandum in general is used by the parties to avoid legal obligation. It's more like a moral commitment between the parties, and the parties rely in good faith to comply with the purpose of the memorandum. When it's about a memorandum between governmental organizations from different countries, it is crucial that the parties identify issues such as which authorities are in charge of executing an international memorandum, governmental priorities and allocation of funds, and the comprehension of the legal framework to avoid a future frustration while performing the memorandum. These issues has been addressed by different panelists during the morning section. I think that Dan was talking about priorities, and the lawyer Orlando Ray was also talking about national strategy in which Cuba set up priorities. And this may seem like a simple issues, but the fact is that they are often overlooked, and the benefit of considering them will outweigh frustration and dormant's memorandum. Let's go over the first issue: authorities allowed in execution an international memorandum. Similar to the United States, in Cuba, the executive branch holds the power to promote international relationships. While the Cuban Constitution establishes the principles and the specific authorities in charge of negotiating and the approval of an international agreement such as treaties, the process in entering a memorandum is more flexible for agencies. This is the same that here in the United States. They used to use memorandums also because it's a flexible tool. Usually, each Cuban agencies had their own international relationship department, and this department is in charge of promoting international collaboration in relation to the agency's duty. Through the promotion of international collaboration, Cuban agencies have the authority to enter into a memorandum with public or private party if the essence in that memorandum is related to the duties of the agency. Therefore, it is important to identify as well as specify the duties of the Cuban agency. For example, a memorandum in which the purpose of the marine ecosystem protection with SIGMA will be the proper party to execute and perform a memorandum. However, if the memorandum is focused more in fishery policies, Ministry of Food of Industry will be an appropriate party to execute and perform that memorandum. And once you recognize Cuban authorities, it is also important to know what goals and objectives has that agency. And that's the second issue, is the governmental priorities and the allocation of funding. The duties of governmental agencies are to achieve goals and objectives through performance of their program. Knowing those goals and objectives will give information to the parties joining a memorandum on whether there is a common ground between them. It would also determine the efficacy in the execution and performance of the memorandum, because the parties are likely to give priority to those goals and objectives over subsequent issues. Additionally, the budgets and resources from the agency will be allocated pursuing their goals and objectives. For example, as in the morning section of this event, the Councilor Orlando Ray was emphasizing in how green energy is one of the top priorities set by the Cuban government strategy. The memorandum related to achieve this goal will likely to be executed and performed promptly than a memorandum in which the purpose is a different matter. Additionally, what federal agencies here in the United States financially support states' programs to implement federal programs within the state to satisfy their goals and objectives. In Cuba, the national government established general policies that determine which objectives have the highest priority. All agencies and governmental institutions of the country must put their efforts forward to complete the objectives addressed by the government. However, the allocation of the budget in Cuban agency will be determined by local governments instead of the national level of agency. In theory, the allocation is done considering the goals and objectives established at the national level, but in practice, the local government will balance the distribution between the national and local goals and objectives. And this is an issue that it was also addressed by Orlando Ray when he was saying how the new constitution is empower local government. This is something that is going to come soon more strongly in practice, and parties joining to a memorandum should consider this new change or this new approach in the governmental structure in Cuba. And the last topic is the comprehension of the legal framework to avoid frustration while performing a memorandum. In general, basis for a successful negotiation relying in a mutual respect of each party's law and policies. The parties should seek out legal advice from lawyers with expertise in environmental issues, but also in administrative regulation. Even when the parties are not legally bound by a memorandum, they still must adhere to lawful activities. For example, the United States has a huge number of regulations that prohibited certain transactions with sanctioned countries such as Cuba, the embargo that we have been talking during the morning section as well. And all these regulations must be taken into account. Therefore, the advice from a legal expert would be essentially to avoid major consequences for environmental organizations who involve with Cuba. This is a reference, this is important because the embargo is going to be a law that is going to keep for a while until a legal process can abrogate this law. But meanwhile, Cuban organizations and American organizations can keep going working in international agreement, considering the legal advice of legal expertise. And Cuba also has a numerous and complex set of regulations within the last couple of years has been subject to continuous change. For that reason, it is important to have an expert familiar with the rulemaking process and the application of that regulation in Cuba. And I would like to conclude what exactly would benefit considering this issue. This is just 3 issues in general, but during the negotiation process, it's going to be, it will address more issues important as well that I will share in a paper for this presentation. And the benefit is the efficacy in negotiating, executing, and performing a memorandum. The parties can reduce time and effort during the negotiation process, and besides, knowing the policies and priority of one another will facilitate the mutual understanding between the parties, governmental organization or non-governmental organization. Thus, the memorandums of understanding purpose will be feasible, and it will be frustrated by law or policies of each country. I think that that's everything, and I will pass over to David again.
Thanks, Jordanka. That was excellent. And let's come to, in our discussion, let's come back to that MOU process and how we might be able to take advantage of that. So we were hearing about MOUs. Now let's shift to transactional documents where we have investors coming in from outside of Cuba to form joint ventures in Cuba. And Lida Hines will address the environmental issues that we'd like to, that everyone would like to see get to the bargaining table, to the negotiation table between Cuban and foreign companies concerning joint ventures in Cuba. Lee?
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone. Glad to be here this afternoon. I fell in love with Cuba when I celebrated New Year's Eve in Cienfuegos on December 31, 2015, going into 2016. Had a wonderful time in Cuba with the National Geographic Society, and we traveled all over the country and really fell in love with it. And so really glad to be participating today. Now, the goal of any foreign investment in Cuba should be sustainable economic development that both benefits Cuba, its citizens, and the investors, and protects the environment. We've heard a lot this morning about sustainability and sustainable development goals that Cuba signed on to in 2015. And the Cuban ambassador to the UN in 2017 said that all UN members must effectively apply the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities between developed and developing countries, reaffirmed by the principles in the 2030 agenda, which is why we just heard Korey talk about the renewable energy goal being part of the 2030 goal. It's the same platform. In other words, treat Cuba fairly, addressing their specific needs. And what I have found in my experience in providing pro bono assistance to civil society groups around the country, around the world, that there really are 4 issues that need to be looked at. The first is, what is the governing law in place that provides protection for the environment? I want to give a shout out to Daimar, who's going to be following me. Daimar, we would have been on the same panel in March of last year talking about some of these same issues, and I really applaud you for your 2017 article titled Environmental Legislation Institutional Framework in Cuba. I'm not going to try to top that with my reading of the Cuba Constitution, other than to say your article lays out the path pretty clearly, both with respect to the authority, how that authority is used, how civil society can participate in implementing the Constitution. The second thing you look at is, once you know what the authority is, you look at what are the laws and procedures in place to implement the law, and what role can civil society play in implementing the law? How are the laws being implemented? It's great to have words written on paper and adopted at the national level, but how they're implemented on the ground in each and every community, really where the truth is told. Then finally, you need to have a place where there's meaningful dialogue between the government, the foreign investor, and the citizens. In other words, have a very transparent process. And what we have found in our work in other countries is, you look at who negotiated the agreement, how public is the agreement, what are the provisions in there for public meetings, public avenues of seeing documents, understanding what the economics are of the project, what are the impacts of the project, and how much money, what kind of money and how much assistance flows down to the local level. So having a power plant jointly funded by, say, a French company and the Cuban government to provide electric power or solar power, how are they educated about how to use solar power, how to benefit from it, and how to live more sustainably. We heard earlier from Hope talking about the anthropologic effects of various projects. We heard this morning about how to deal with agricultural aquaculture. All of those things are joint ventures. All of those things affect how the economy is benefited and how you can best benefit the citizens. And so having a right to know what's going on, to see what the government is doing, to see what the permits provide, to be able to have access to documents to understand the impacts is critically important. And and I think where ACOL can be of great assistance is to work with civil society and say, okay, what are the authorities? What does the joint venture partner want to do? What do the documents look like? What are going to be the benefits and impacts of that? What revenue is going to come in? How revenue is going to be shared so that the process is sustainable. It provides growth for the future of the country of Cuba, but at the same time provides benefits to the citizens. And you can only better understand your benefits if you know what's going on. That's back to the issue of transparency. So multinational corporations, which would typically be the ones who would be entering into the joint venture, are going to be operating more often than not under some sort of ESG principles. Most multinational corporations have developed sustainable development protocol. They are following a variety of Global Resource Institute GRI principles when they do their reporting, when they do their sustainable reporting or their corporate social responsibility reporting. And so you want to know all of that on the front side so you know you can hold them accountable for what they have promised the rest of the world they would do. They're going to do the same good things in Cuba. You want to know what the process is to be open-minded about it. You want to understand how the investment will benefit Cuba in the long run, not just in the short run to make the pocketbook, if you will, of the Cuban government bigger. I live in the state of Georgia in the United States. We call ourselves the best state in the United States in which to do business, which means come to our state, we'll provide you with economic incentives to be here, but at the same time, we want to be sure you protect our citizens, you provide jobs, and the revenue is going to be revenue that's spread across the entirety of the governmental structure, not just kept in the national purse, never seen on the ground at the local government level. So making sure the entire process is transparent is key to the joint ventures, understanding all the impacts and effects of that. And again, that's where our work in providing pro bono assistance, as we've done in other places, would benefit the citizens of Cuba to better understand how economic investment is going to affect the country. And I think this is something we can talk about more with. Liliana talked about civil society goals and roles in Cuba this morning. We've heard a couple of different conversations about what the constitutional authority is. And Amendment 70, or Article 75, I think is really the critical provision of the Cuban Constitution of my reading, which is it links sustainable development to the rights of Cuban citizens. And in Chapter 6 of the Constitution guarantees rights to redress grievances to all Cuban citizens. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Lee. That was an excellent addressing of the key issues there. And again, something we should come back to in our discussion that will follow the presentation. So thank you very much. We're now going to move to the two Spanish-speaking presenters. So those of us who will need to do so will have to move over to the simultaneous translation for the next two speakers. the first of whom is Daimar Canovas, and he'll speak on the biodiversity protection as a space for Cuba-US cooperation. So Daimar, the floor is yours.
Gracias. Muchas gracias al moderador y muchas gracias a los miembros del panel y a la Fundación Nuñez Jiménez por el espacio acá en La Habana para compartir, ¿no? Creo que todos somos conscientes de que los problemas ambientales no pueden ser enfrentados unilateralmente por los estados, ni por las administraciones públicas, ni a nivel local, ni a nivel nacional. Esta mañana hubo amplias referencias al cambio climático como uno de esos paradigmas de los problemas ambientales globales, pero también las amenazas a la biodiversidad no encuentran solución sino en la cooperación, ¿no? No vale de nada el esfuerzo unilateral de un Estado, por muy grande que sea su contribución a la economía mundial. Esas amenazas a la biodiversidad en el caso cubano están plenamente identificadas. Me voy a servir acá del 6º reporte que hizo la República de Cuba, el Convenio de Diversidad Biológica. Se mencionan la fragmentación de los hábitats, los efectos de la contaminación ambiental, los incendios rurales y forestales, prácticas agrícolas no sostenibles, pesca, caza, tala furtiva, comercio ilegal de especies. Las autoridades cubanas no han estado ajenas a estos fenómenos, ¿no? Hay, digamos que, una serie de documentos políticos y de un marco jurídico para enfrentar estas cuestiones. En el ámbito político tenemos el Programa Nacional de Diversidad Biológica. El último está concebido para aplicarse entre los años 2011 y 2020. Y en el marco jurídico al que se ha referido en la presentación anterior, ¿no? Tenemos no solo la ley marco, la ley 81 del medio ambiente, sino toda la legislación complementaria relativa a la biodiversidad, que en estos momentos se encuentra bajo revisión. Creo que esa es una de las grandes oportunidades que tenemos hoy. El nuevo texto constitucional de 2019 prevé un cronograma legislativo que aplique esos preceptos, entre ellos el artículo 75 del texto constitucional ya mencionado. Ese Programa Nacional de la Biodiversidad tiene o identifica unos campos de acción, unos ámbitos de actuación que creo que serían las líneas de actuación prioritaria en la cooperación si nos reducimos a los marcos de la biodiversidad. Menciono por acá, por ejemplo, la valoración económica de los servicios ecosistémicos, el incremento de la reforestación, pero con especies nativas, el fortalecimiento de colecciones biológicas, la rehabilitación y restauración de ecosistemas para evitar la fragmentación. Creo que en este sentido también se dirigen los instrumentos jurídicos firmados a partir del 2014. Entre ellos me voy a referir en específico a la de conjunta de noviembre de 2015 entre ambos gobiernos. Ahí identifica unas áreas de cooperación en materia de diversidad que coinciden sustancialmente con las identificadas con el Programa Nacional de Diversidad Biológica. Por tanto, no creo que haya dificultad. Y en muchos de estos casos, como en materia de caza, tráfico ilegal, protección de especies migratorias, la cooperación, más que un deseo, es un imperativo. O sea, no se pueden lograr esos fines si no hay la cooperación bilateral o multilateral en este caso. Y además, no es una encomienda o no es una misión exclusiva de la administración pública. También tiene que ser parte la sociedad civil cubana del cumplimiento de esos objetivos. Para ello tienen que participar instituciones académicas, universidades, institutos, organizaciones no gubernamentales, y al final esa participación se traduce en intercambios, en viajes, en entrada y salida de equipos, materiales, muestras, como explícitamente establecen los convenios, pero mientras existan las restricciones a las que ya se ha hecho referencia, un poco que el avance en esos objetivos se hace muy difícil, ¿no? La cooperación entre Cuba y los Estados Unidos en materia de protección ambiental y en específico en materia de biodiversidad es útil, pero más no solo vale citar aquí lo que establece la ley ha habido un programa político marcado en los últimos años dirigido a las prioridades identificadas. Ya se mencionó antes la tarea vida como plan del Estado para enfrentamiento al cambio climático, pero muy recientemente tenemos un plan gubernamental para el enfrentamiento de delitos e ilegalidades que afecten los recursos forestales, la flora y la fauna silvestre. Se trata de un plan muy amplio y que tiene una serie de acciones de distinta naturaleza que incluye desde estrategia de comunicación, estudio de población de especies amenazadas, fortalecimiento de sistemas de vigilancia, y creo que es otra oportunidad más para la cooperación bilateral. A pesar de que los textos de los convenios que se firmaron, de los memorandos que se firmaron, hacen énfasis en que no se trata de instrumentos jurídicamente vinculantes, si no hay un imperativo legal para que esto se produzca, si hay un imperativo moral de ambas partes para que haya una adecuada protección a la vida, a la biodiversidad en sus distintas manifestaciones. Muchas gracias.
Thank you for that, Timar. Very helpful, and we'll come back to this as well in just a little bit, and how this all interacts with ways we can collaborate. Before we get to that general discussion, the last of our presenters, Yociel Marerro, on the future of Cuba-US relations. Yociel.
Buenas tardes. Gracias a todos por la participación, la organización. Yo quiero enfocarme en algo que he venido siempre compartiendo con mis colegas aquí en Cuba y mis colegas de Estados Unidos. Es que yo estoy convencido de que el futuro de las relaciones de Cuba-Estados Unidos tiene que circular inevitablemente para promover proyectos ambientalmente responsables para el desarrollo sostenible. Es bien conocido que los orígenes y temas de los conflictos entre Cuba y Estados Unidos han sido muy abordados desde todas sus perspectivas y utilizados con disímiles propósitos en diferentes momentos y circunstancias de la historia. Eso todos lo conocemos y se aborda en todos estos tipos de encuentros que tenemos. Pero en la actualidad nos vamos dando cuenta que no solo compartimos una historia regional y un área geográfica dentro del planeta, sino también recursos naturales distribuidos en diferentes ecosistemas que se interrelacionan entre sí, sobre todo, independientemente de designios gubernamentales, decisiones políticas o preferencias ideológicas. Entonces, si asumimos bien esta evidencia, se convierte en un compromiso inevitable juntar esfuerzos entre todos los sectores de ambos países para trabajar en lo que pudiera convertirse el punto de convergencia más sólido de las relaciones bilaterales. Trabajar en lo que pudiera convertirse ese punto más sólido, que es la protección de los recursos naturales desde la promoción de proyectos ambientalmente responsables para el desarrollo sostenible. Este gran propósito debe implementarse conjuntamente en dos líneas de acciones al mismo tiempo. Por una parte, una línea formativa, que sería crear nuevas capacidades profesionales, incentivar conocimientos e intercambiar experiencias a través de cursos, talleres, pasantías, maestrías y doctorados, y otra línea para ejecutar proyectos prácticos innovadores en áreas clave como la agricultura, el turismo, la industria, el futuro. Y fundamentalmente voy a hablar de mi experiencia que estamos compartiendo, que como quiera que sea es una experiencia transversal para muchas instituciones de Estados Unidos y de Cuba. Aunque como sabemos las relaciones siempre han sido bien complejas, hay estos antecedentes que demuestran la viabilidad de trabajar juntos en estos temas, resultando de experiencias beneficiosas para ambas partes y que después contribuyeron factores de influencia en la transformación de políticas y estrategias en cada uno de nuestros países. Mi formación y labor profesional se entrelaza mucho con estos ejemplos. Hace casi 20 años, trabajando en el programa de saneamiento del río Almendares del Parque Metropolitano de La Habana, conocí a través de la organización californiana Global Exchange al importante profesor Bob Gigher. Él en ese momento pudo dar varias conferencias en La Habana e intercambiamos ideas y planes para sanear nuestras cuencas hidrográficas. Un tiempo después de habernos conocido y después de cruzar engorrosos trámites por ambas partes, pude viajar a California y estudiar en Humboldt State University bajo la guía del profesor Guy Hare. Ahí adquirí las herramientas fundamentales para el diseño y operación de los sistemas naturales para el tratamiento de aguas residuales que en los siguientes 10 años se instalaron y tanto contribuyeron al saneamiento del río Almendares, llegando incluso a obtener el reconocimiento de la Unión de Ingenieros de Cuba. Los resultados de los estudios y monitoreo sistemático que se desarrollaron de esas obras de ingeniería aportaron datos a los manuales de la Environmental Protection Agency de los Estados Unidos para los parámetros de diseño en climas tropicales de esos sistemas, que hasta ese momento los manuales de la EPA no tenían. Así, de esta manera se cerró el ciclo para la generación continua de beneficios mutuos. Ya después, en el 2011, a partir de las transformaciones socioeconómicas que se implementaron en Cuba, nuestro equipo de la Fundación se empeñó en introducir elementos de sostenibilidad ambiental en esas nuevas transformaciones. Así llegué a Bard College en Nueva York a un encuentro sobre estrategias para una nueva economía. Las herramientas y nuevos enfoques que se compartieron en esa ocasión nos han servido para el trabajo de acompañamiento desarrollado para armonizar el trabajo del sector privado en la evolución de sus modelos de gestión. En estos temas ha sido vital los encuentros e intercambios de bibliografía que hemos tenido con el Gong Institute for Ecological Economics de la Universidad de Vermont, el Schumacher Center, que aunque se fueron reduciendo al mínimo por los motivos bien conocidos, todavía se sienten sus efectos en proyectos que implementamos hoy. Haber compartido estos resultados y disímiles opiniones y análisis con los miembros de la Association for the Study of Cuban Economy en su conferencia anual, como antes lo habían hecho otros expertos cubanos, ha contribuido a demostrar lo importante, y esto es, remarco en esto, de crear espacios de influencia e intercambio similares a este. Y el desarrollo sostenible de nuestros países, no hay duda, debe que ser el tema aglutinador. Fundaciones como la Ford, Reynolds y Baum, junto a otras, además del Center for Democracy in the Americas, WOLA y el Social Sciences Research Council, han estado apoyando periódicamente el funcionamiento de estos espacios. Hay otros ejemplos de relaciones que se han establecido entre instituciones académicas, científicas y organizaciones no gubernamentales de los Estados Unidos y Cuba que exploran alternativas para propiciar formas de desarrollo sostenible en disímiles temas colaterales que lo complementan. Quiero cerrar con algunas propuestas de tópicos, fundamentos, acciones y estrategias para hacer que esto funcione. ¿Cómo debemos hacer que esto funcione? Tal vez sea este el momento para ambos países, para ambos lados, de aprender a trabajar juntos desde nuestras realidades en proyectos que propicien un desarrollo socioeconómico que genere bienestar humano dentro de los límites del bienestar del planeta. El sentido integrador de las acciones ambientales desde todos los ángulos es una oportunidad para hacer funcionar esta cooperación sustentada en debemos establecer de forma conjunta relaciones con instituciones financieras para tener acceso a fondos para proyectos multinacionales de recuperación y protección de ecosistemas. Debemos tocar aspectos como el crecimiento y desarrollo en una economía diseñada para la sostenibilidad y la prosperidad, las relaciones entre el consumo, los sistemas tributarios y financieros con los recursos naturales en el desarrollo sostenible, equidad y bienestar en futuros posibles, los temas de acumulación de capital y concentración, el uso sostenible de la energía, el agua y otros recursos naturales. En los temas que ya fueron tocados por uno de los panelistas en este panel, de la inversión extranjera y los recursos naturales bajo un nuevo modelo económico, el uso de combustibles y la soberanía energética, los sistemas tributarios, los bancos y otras características regulatorias en un sistema financiero justo. También abordar, y es el momento para eso, nuevas formas y vías de organización para modelos comerciales responsables y la participación de otras formas económicas. El papel de los principales motores económicos en un modelo de desarrollo sostenible, como los motores del desarrollo económico que en Cuba en casi todas partes son, que es la agricultura, el turismo, la minería y la industria. Y así, a forma de cierre, creo que es un buen momento para nosotros adentrarnos y compartir procesos y echar a andar procesos de innovación social e innovación en la gestión empresarial. Esto es lo que sería mi presentación, que realmente es apostar y convencernos cada uno de todas las partes de las organizaciones no gubernamentales, instituciones académicas y científicas, que toda acción que tomemos tiene que tener unos fundamentos, tiene que llevar un proceso, pero hay que dar los primeros pasos. Y los primeros pasos deben ser en estos temas inevitablemente. Gracias.
Thank you, Yociel. Let me stay with you for a second, Yociel, since you just finished your talk. And that is, as I'm listening to your descriptions, would your proposition be that a focus on joint projects being those that would be geared toward benefiting everyone, not focused on a particular country, but let's work on projects that will benefit all, choose topics that are of equal importance or of primary importance to the people of both countries?
Al mismo tiempo, y que nuestras relaciones bilaterales pueden ser puntos pivot, puntos de partida para que repercutan en la región. Buenas relaciones o buenos procesos en los temas de desarrollo sostenible van a repercutir urgentemente en nuestra región, que es el Caribe, y en todo el Caribe insular y en todos los ecosistemas de nuestra área. Y una propuesta puede ser integrarnos de forma conjunta en soluciones por regiones. Pero sí, es lo que tú decías, David, es importante que nosotros sepamos trabajar, nos unamos bien en la forma de trabajar para repercutir también en nuestras regiones de la que estamos en nuestro hemisferio.
Every presenter here has raised issues in which we find correlation between problems being faced by both countries. Everything from the very first presentation on, and some of the particular notes that I was highlighting for coming back to, we were talking right from the start, the coastal resilience issue raised by Pam, including, the very apt description of Cuba being out there like the tip of the spear coming toward the larger landmass of the US. The discussions about protecting the urban environment, the fishing issues, which are common to both countries, concepts of renewable energy development, and on and on. So let me just start among this group, and if just literally raise your hand if you have a thought, but we've all been listening to each other. Any follow-up points that any of you would like to make, or points that you would like to take further right now, having heard this discussion? Lee, I see you. So raising your hand. So would you take it away?
Well, my talk was about how to make foreign investment transparent. I guess I would like to hear from our friends in Cuba whether they think that foreign investment in Cuba has been done well, done poorly. I know obviously you want more of it, but what has been done there, you think it's been done well and been beneficial to the country?
I can talk.
Yordanka, you'd like to speak?
Yes, I would like to speak also based on my experience. I was before came here, United States, I was working specifically in a joint venture project focusing on agriculture. And at that point, I was learning how the foreign party was addressing environmental issue regarding the during the negotiation process. And at the same occurred from the Cuban side. And I was very impressed. I was advising the foreign company. And one of the issues that we deal was that because the presentation of the project did not figure it out exactly in which location in the sea this project will be performed, the Cuban agency, it was SITMA, the environmental regulation from SITMA, denied a license to this project. I wanted to bring this example because this is a specific example of how Cuba takes so seriously in their environmental issue, even knowing that we are encouraged international investment because we are relying on international investment to bet for our future economy. Still, Cuba is considering environmental regulation and is very strict to grant a permission without considering the respect of that environmental regulation in Cuba.
So for example, the big port project that's proceeding now, or has been proceeding, the port development, were environmental issues, do we know to what extent environmental issues and impacts were involved in the planning of that project? And is that the sort of project on which additional attention could be addressed or could be discussed? If anyone would like to, I'm just looking for an example so that we can get an understanding of what is already on the table and being addressed in such joint venture negotiations. Well, while you're pondering that, let me ask. Oh, Daimar has thoughts. Daimar.
Sí, gracias. Desde el punto de vista legislativo, hay un respaldo a los intereses, digamos, ambientales desde la propia Ley de Inversión Extranjera, que es del año 2014. Esa Ley de Inversión Extranjera prevé la participación del Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, del SITMA, desde que se presenta por el inversionista extranjero la idea de proyecto. O sea, en la misma revisión preliminar que se hace, ya se toman en cuenta esas consideraciones ambientales, con independencia de la licencia ambiental y el resto de las licencias, la permisología, como se hablaba antes, que lleve el proyecto en cuestión. Pero además, y aquí quiero insistir, porque en un punto neurálgico de inversión extranjera, como es la zona especial de desarrollo Mariel, donde se ha estado focalizando esa inversión extranjera, hay una norma específica para esa zona de desarrollo especial, pero esa norma específica no relaja, no suaviza las regulaciones ambientales, establece un procedimiento más rápido, pero sin dejar de exigir los requisitos generales para que se exigen en cualquier parte del país. Solo eso.
Dan, let me ask a follow-up question, which is, do our friends in Cuba believe that civil society and the citizens know what's going on, or are they kind of just informed about it after the fact? What's the role of, how transparent is this process?
Yociel, did you want to, were you pointing out that you wanted to respond to that? I'm not.
Sí, puedo responderle. I can answer about this last question and just add something to the comments of Marerro. Of course, all the Cuban environmental law and in the new investment include all these regulations to the new investment and the environment.
Oh, okay.
But still, it's need more connection with the responsible investment, respect to environmental responsible investment, in the using of raw materials, in the way to, in what natural resources they will be using, and mainly in the effects of all those production that is having, and the possibilities having of Cuba. It still is things that we should continue working on that, and mainly in what kind of environmental management those investment will be doing during the production and during the operation and performing in the time that they will be working in producing in the area that they are performing. That is things that still we should continue working, and is an exhibition to all those new investors and foreign investors. And respect to the question of Lee, yes, all the information is public. Everybody that wants to know what is happening, what new investing, it's what is happening there, is possible to know. And I think that the government is very open to inform in different media what is new on foreign investment, and mainly in big things, in big factories, and all the things that it's doing in Zona Franca de Mariel. It's very well known.
Thanks. Question, Jordanka, for you in terms of the discussion on MOUs and what we were hearing also Daimar speak to in terms of Article 75 in the Constitution. Would MOUs be appropriate with local governmental authorities in Cuba?
I will speak first, and then Daimar want to say something else. So as I was commenting in my presentation, since the recently Constitution was passed, the government is trying to empower or empower more local government, municipalities, and provincial government. Before the Constitution, the municipal governments and the provincial level government, they can sign memorandum of understanding and international agreement. Before the Constitution, that was already allowed. It's just part of the local governments improve their international cooperation, and they have their international relations department, and they can, on the determined process that the law establishes, they can establish international agreement or cooperation agreements to implement projects in local levels.
Thank you, Jordanka. Daimar, did you wish to add to that at all?
Sí, el profesor Lee también se refería a la posibilidad que da la ley vigente, ¿no? La ley de medio ambiente se refería a la ley 81, que es del año 97. Creo que la reforma constitucional del 2019 marca una pauta que va a seguir la futura legislación. Lo que pasa es que estamos hablando ahora de proyectos legislativos que aún no han sido aprobados, pero la intención de los legisladores, de los que están trabajando como comisión, como grupo, en una nueva ley de medio ambiente, es que el énfasis se ponga precisamente en hacer efectivo ese derecho a un medio ambiente sano. Orlando hablaba esta mañana del acceso a la justicia, del acceso a la información y de la participación pública. Bueno, estamos previendo que esa ley regule con precisión cuáles son los mecanismos de participación, cuáles son los mecanismos para acceder a la información ambiental, sea general o sea puntual a partir de una solicitud previa. E igualmente la ley tiene que corresponder también, y ahí reafirmo lo que decía Jordán, con la autonomía municipal que está reconociendo la Constitución. O hasta hoy esas facultades de la autoridad ambiental han estado más bien concentradas a nivel provincial y a nivel nacional. Es necesario que esas facultades entonces se desconcentren, se descentralicen, y en ese sentido también va el proyecto en el que se está trabajando. Gracias.
Okay, thanks. I'm watching the clock because I definitely want to give Yociel his time. I also want to make sure we get to questions. I'll ask Meg in a moment whether there are any in Spanish to be posed. Just in the meantime, another question from me to the panel. We heard Korey talking about the current mix of energy resources, and we also heard how amenable renewable like solar would be. Is this an area where joint ventures have been or could be developed under existing Cuban law? A joint venture on renewable energy development? And if anyone would like to answer that question, if you could literally raise your hand. Looks like Yociel and Korey both have something to say.
Let's first Korey, better.
Fine.
I'll just be brief because I think Yociel will be better. But yes, there have been joint ventures on both solar and wind, utility scale solar and wind projects in Cuba.
Yociel, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, their joint venture 2 years ago. Cuba presents a business portfolio of all the possible business on the producing energy from biomass and the solar panels or solar energy farms, offering to international and foreign investment. And they're for their specific business opportunity portfolio for the possibility of produce renewable energy on a joint venture or in a business together with Cuba. There is very specific. Is there in some place in internet.
Dan Whittle has a question or comment, and then Pam Giblin. Dan.
Yeah, David, I'll just add to that. So I think the major constraints on investment in Cuba is on the U.S. side. So if private sector companies, solar and wind, want to invest in Cuba, Cuban law permits it. There are processes set up to allow it, but the constraints are on our side, and they could be handled through executive action, don't require an act of Congress. This is a huge opportunity for the private sector in the US. It's consistent with President Biden's clean energy export and climate investment initiative. And it's a way to perhaps move Cuba away from offshore oil drilling, which would be devastating potentially to the US, and facilitate their transition beyond 24%. I think they could go further than 24% by 2030 with the right kind of partnerships and collaboration. So just wanted to add that. I think that should be a priority for cooperation.
Thanks, Dan. Pam Giblin, you had a comment.
Yeah, and it's just it sort of follows on to what Dan just said. To our Cuban colleagues, if you had one piece of advice to give an American company wanting to invest in Cuba, what one piece of advice would you give an American company wanting to do a big project in Cuba?
I can take this one first. I would like to take it. So first, Pam, you know, you are a lawyer. You know that sometimes negotiation is not only about knowing the law. It's right. about knowing culture from both countries. Right. Sometimes you are referring to a term that's the both country different that means something different. Right. So a good thing is that you have wonderful lawyers here that know how to deal with embargo and sanctioned regulation. But you also need to know and deal and get the advice from lawyer from Cuba who really knows how to go through all the application process in foreign investment. And that is very specific, as well as United States, all the regulation process for foreign investment is a written law because it's administrative law. And go through this, it takes a lot of time and it needs a lot of experts. So my first advice, go to get the advice of a Cuban lawyer in the area as well.
There was a question from the attendees to the Cuban legal experts that I hope I'll phrase correctly. But aside from the constitutional law on cleaning up, on the obligation to remediate contamination, is there also some sort of a compensatory damages arrangement when people have been hurt, when property has been damaged? But let's stick with people when there's been a compensation scheme. Orlando, Daimar, to begin with, any comment on that? Daimar, you want to start?
Sí, a ver, en el tema de compensaciones, creo que hay instrumentos internacionales que han sido, en este caso la ley 81, se tiene un capítulo dedicado específicamente a la responsabilidad por daño ambiental, en este caso a la responsabilidad civil por daño ambiental, donde se establecen compensaciones para la víctima, en este caso sea la comunidad en general o una persona natural o jurídica en concreto. Ciertamente no ha sido de los capítulos más aplicados de la ley, pero no se puede decir que no han sido aplicados del todo. O sea, ha habido litigios ambientales en los tribunales cubanos. En estos 20 y tantos años de aplicación de la ley 81, no han sido numerosos, pero sí ha habido litigios, incluso algunos interesantes. El primero del que tuve noticias, por ejemplo, fue precisamente una acción de una persona natural, de un ciudadano, contra organismos del Estado cubano por una autorización dada. Por tanto, esos mecanismos no se han dado, pero no porque la ley, o no se han dado mucho, pero no porque la ley los limite en alguna medida, sino porque hemos o se han utilizado mecanismos de solución de conflictos no jurisdiccionales.
Thank you, Daimar. I'll just, since I had asked Orlando, I'll just ask whether Orlando wants to make any further comment on that or other issues that he's been patiently listening to.
Oh, no, thank you, David. I think it's okay. Daimar is correct. It's not a matter of limitation on the law, but mostly of some kind of culture around that kind of issue that tend to be addressed in the administrative view more than in the legal setting. But anyway, I was just multitasking between the workshop and between another task. So maybe I lost something. If there is something else more specific that you want me to address, I am ready to do that.
I didn't, this morning we were talking about constitutional issues, which Daimar has been good enough to address in greater detail this afternoon. But please stay with us, because I'm gonna pause just to ask Meg if I've missed a question. And after that, I would like to be able to turn this over to Yociel to start us moving into the final section of this, in which we can all still be commenting, but I did want to give both Yociel a little more time to speak, and then Meg wrap up time. So everyone, please stay where you are. And I am going to ask my friend Yociel Marerro to now take over the moderating of the next section of this event.
I'm ready here, try to do an abstract recommendation of all the conference, but mainly if in the audience there are moments for people to recommend the next step, just to solidify and just to really perform all the proposal that we have been proponing here in the panel. I think it's a good moment. I have some colleague in line. Maybe I would like to give the floor to Mark Grombayer or William Hernandez Requejo, that I want that they share in no more than 2 minutes what they are recommending now to continue as an example of positive collaboration on sustainable solution for sustainable development.
First of all, let me begin in Spanish, please. Primero, quisiera dar las gracias a Yociel y en particular a Liliana Nuñez y a toda la gente de FANG por el trabajo que están haciendo, por las oportunidades que están dando a todo el mundo. Y bueno, estoy sumamente agradecido por esta oportunidad. Entonces, si me permiten, me gustaría cambiar entonces al inglés. I'd like to begin maybe perhaps by stating what may be perceived as the obvious. And here in the United States, and I'm speaking to our Cuban friends, we have this saying, and it's based on relationships, that we're only 7 degrees removed from Kevin Bacon. Well, I want to propose to you that virtually all transactions in Cuba are 2 or 3 degrees removed from Meg Carhan. And so we actually find ourselves in a wonderful situation. And I want to thank Professor Carhan for her leadership and vision at the University of Columbia. Let me, if I may, just give a quick brief introduction. I'm faculty at the Paul Merage School of Business at the University of California, Irvine. I want to dovetail real quickly in that role as part of the U.S. Negotiation Lab with Lee DeHines and that emphasis and focus on what we describe as externalities. If you do put in a renewable energy system within the microgrid environment that Korey most certainly alluded to, we most certainly find that the externalities, the jobs, the way that that has the ramification effects must be taken in consideration. And we work almost exclusively within that transparent environment that's most certainly. So over the past 12 years of that collaboration with Cuba.
As we get into this end discussion that we're getting into, is focusing on the ways we can actually be collaborating on particular projects moving forward. So do you have a particular thought, rather than, I mean, you obviously are very much involved for a very distinguished organization, and the University of California, Irvine is close to our heart. My wife graduated from there. Thoughts particularly on what we've been discussing in terms of, if there was one, just like Pam asked the question, if there's one thing to get it by, you know, that you know, the Cuban set would ask us, would tell us is the most important. If you could boil down to one single most important issue on which you think we could collaborate, what would it be?
It's dovetailing on Korey's comment as to looking at either wind or solar energy within a distribution mechanism. It was precisely, that was my point where I'm sorry, and thank you for focusing me even more. We use the lab as essentially that, think of it as an academic commercial watering hole, a meeting place, and we bring projects to there. The person that will be following me is in essence, he and I have actually collaborated in that area, and that's Mark Grobmeyer. And so what I wanted to do is set the tone for it and then have Mark go ahead and show some of the specific projects.
Thank you for your information and your contribution. I would like to give the floor to Mark Grobmeyer just to complement. No more than 2 minutes, please. We have a lot of recommendations to be summarizing.
Well, again, I would like to thank Yociel and Fanj, all the others, Columbia University and everyone for this wonderful program. I'm chairman of an organization called the Global Solutions Summit that was organized as a result of a meeting between the Club de Madrid, which some of you may know. It's a group of about 115 former presidents and prime ministers from 60 countries, and another initiative Prince Charles had started called the P80 Group. And the two groups came together and signed an agreement to work together. And one of the things that they have done is to specifically focus on specific projects. And so one of these is called GTED2, or Global Technology Expo for Deployment Demonstration. The idea is to create some pilot projects where multiple technologies can be displayed and be interconnected at the same venue. And so we have talked in the past with Yociel and others at Fanj about different potential project locations in Cuba. Some of the technologies could be included, for things like a solar-powered pest control system, a very inexpensive solar-powered water desalination for organic farming, making ag lime from limestone to convert fields from acidic soil to more productive soil, and several other technologies. And so we are looking for a few sites in Cuba to do that, and not just for Cuba, but we see Cuba as being a great platform to showcase these technologies to the entire Caribbean region and other island states. We work with the Alliance of Small Island States, and many of the things such as having distributed power in Cuba that was talked about earlier today, we really believe is the future. And there are also some other technologies like the stealth power can convert diesel generators to hybrids overnight, which reduces the fuel consumption and emissions by 75%. So in other words, there are a lot of very specific deployments that can take place and be showcased in Cuba, not just for the Cuban people and the Cuban island, but also other island states in the Caribbean and around the world. So
that gets to a question actually that I see had been asked that we should raise with our Cuban friends, Mark, and so that the group as a whole understands it, which is, what is the situation right now in terms of availability of clean water? Are there already substantial efforts at in water infrastructure in terms of clean water supply? And let me just stop there so that the whole audience can have some insight on why Mark would be talking about some of these projects. And who among the group I can see right now might want to speak to that. Jordanka, is that something in your knowledge base?
What is the specific question, David, please? Because
we were talking about, Mark was talking about water supply desalinization and the like, whether for potable or industrial or agricultural use. What is the status today in Cuba of such projects?
There in Cuba right now, there are some specific project in some specific area of the desalinization, but it still is not using for agriculture irrigation is using for human consumption in some area that it's very difficult to access to fresh water. And there are like 3 projects in difficult area access that we are using desalination technology, but for fresh water. Really, it's a technology, very expensive, but it's because of that, it's applying on small communities, but still it's not using desalinated water for irrigation in agriculture.
Got it. Yociel, you should probably, we should probably yes. get to the summing up, and because we need to leave some time for Meg. Dan, did you want to add something first?
I think we had
yes, yeah.
Justine in line to speak up if there's still time.
Yes, still. Again, if before give the floor to Justine Williams, I would like if there are some of the audience of the panelists that want to make some specific recommendation on the topic or the steps, the next step that we should just follow in next time to more concrete step in the future, which could be the next step for this collaboration on environmental topics. And please just raise the hand or the way that you find better. It's good. I want to invite Justine Williams to make some recommendation.
Hi, Yociel. Thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me on. I'll be brief because I know everyone's running out of time, but thank you for the wonderful presentations today. I, like Hope, I'm an anthropologist, have done research in Cuba, and also am the managing director of an organization called the Platform for Innovation and Dialogue with Cuba. The comment I want to make is really very simple, I think, but it's one that gets overlooked surprisingly often, and really kind of dovetails your Danka with your amazing advice earlier today, which is that as much as we have in common between the US and Cuba, it's also really hard for anyone to collaborate, whether you're in the same country or across borders, and all of the amazing projects and MOUs that we've heard talked about today have an amazing backstory of people really working hard to achieve them. So I want to recommend that we really continue to focus on opportunities for people, simply really diverse stakeholders from Cuba and the US, experts, policymakers, but also young people, people from grassroots organizations, people from rural areas, continue to have opportunities to come together and talk about the social challenges around all of these, the technical concerns and challenges that we're talking about today. I've been in a lot of experiences where there can be a lot of kind of anxiety around what the outcome will be, but so often it's just this trust building that really sows the seeds. So I hope that's a helpful comment, and thank you all today for the really wonderful insights.
Excellent
Thank
comment.
You.
Right.
Yes, Dan, you want to make some remarks or something?
Not at the moment. I'll let others talk. I'm happy to make some recommendations a little later. But
okay, there are other panelists, Orlando, Dimer from that side, Margarita, Patricia, some specific recommendation. Anyway, we'll have the possibility just to summarize recommendation that each panelist present in the briefing papers that they have been presented here. Yes, Pam.
I'm sorry. It's been so exciting to hear about all the things that are going on in both countries. So one suggestion, one concrete suggestion, is to have some sort of compendium of information where we could go to one place and know the various projects. And that way, you know, nobody's reinventing the wheel, because I'm hearing about things that I go, boy, that would have great applicability over here. And so I just think we need to figure out how to have that compendium of information that's readily accessible by everybody. And that would be quite a contribution. And maybe Columbia can take a sort of a laboring oar at, you know, making sure that that's compiled, because I suspect that everybody has to kind of go to a lot of different places to find all of these exciting things that are going on in the things that could trigger some additional thought about how to improve things. We could be thought leaders.
Okay, you know, still we have, David, we have two questions that I think have been not answering from René Costales and Jorge Piñón that Korey answered, but I don't want if, I want to know if Orlando is there? If Orlando would like to answer some of these questions.
Thank you, Yociel.
René.
Would you repeat the question, yes, please? What's
the question is if the issue of including remediation, mitigation, but also compensatory environmental benefits is also included in the regulatory framework.
We just that Daimar actually spoke to that, yes, but yes, I would be delighted to hear Orlando's take on it.
I think, as you said, that Daimar provided an explanation of that, but in my personal view, that is in the law, but it's in a very diffuse manner. There are not a specific mechanism. I agree that this is an area in which we can collaborate to develop the more instrumental ways to implement that. So there is an area we can identify from the legal point of view as an area of interest to collaborate.
More recommendation from panelists, or what specific recommendation? We still will have time for the final report, concentrate foundations.
Yes, I'll simply run down some of the points from, and that could be jumping off points. I'll stop when anyone else wants to jump in. But starting from this morning, when Orlando talked about cooperating on sustainable development, when Valerie talked about reef protection and resiliency, when Pam talked about the mutual interest in coastal resilience, comments about protection of the urban environment, which we touched on. Bear with me. The Hope's discussion on the fishing issues, where there is certainly huge amount of space for collaboration.
Yes, I think from the morning recommendation, I will continue in Spanish, better, I think, to better understand. Fue muy importante que Dan realizó un repaso de los momentos relevantes de la cooperación, y eso indudablemente fue de gran ayuda. Asimismo, Liliana puso ejemplos determinados de todo el trabajo de la Fundación que ha venido haciendo por más de 25 años con diferentes agencias de los Estados Unidos, y Orlando expresó que debemos concentrarnos en el valor global de la cooperación, además del impacto bilateral. Explicó que el escenario nacional de Cuba es muy dinámico desde las políticas públicas que validan la importancia de la cooperación internacional. Y sobre todo, Orlando se refirió a que el cambio climático ofrece una oportunidad de cooperación, que es un tema que muchos de nosotros hemos estado recuperando y que sería uno de los sentidos fundamentales de esta conferencia. y es una oportunidad de conectar los esfuerzos de mitigación y, por supuesto, que la cooperación científica puede sentar las bases para otras formas de cooperación. Patricia explicó todo lo que se ha hecho desde el año 2000, cómo se han expandido las investigaciones en ciencias marinas y cómo puede continuar, y eso lo tratamos también en este panel, cómo se pudiera continuar en zonas geográficas como el Gran Caribe y el Golfo de México, y resaltó el trabajo con EDF, además de The Ocean Foundation. El valor, Patricia reseñó también el valor de las publicaciones como el Marine Sciences y importante que fue señalado también por otros panelistas como yo mismo y en el panel, el valor de la formación de capacidades e investigaciones. Fune dio toda una visión histórica que nos conduce, nos lleva a las relaciones económicas y políticas que han tenido Cuba, Estados Unidos, pero que es un llamado también de alguna manera a continuar en esta forma de seguir trabajando y a impulsando, y hizo algunas recomendaciones que aparecerán también de alguna manera en la necesidad de buscar, sobre todo, Funes lo puntualizó, experiencias positivas para inspirar el trabajo futuro. Esto como statement lírico, poético, está muy bien, que es la necesidad de buscar, y lo repetiré, experiencias positivas para inspirar el trabajo futuro. Y él mencionó muchas de esas experiencias. Y que el desarrollo sostenible ofrece un amplio terreno para aprender mutuamente, como también fue presentado en otras ponencias. Margarita de BCI nos contó de todo el desarrollo y del potencial desarrollo en el futuro de la red agroecológica Cuba-Estados Unidos, y el trabajo, sobre todo, fue un ejemplo con los pequeños productores cubanos que también de alguna manera se entrelazan con los hacedores de política, las universidades y los centros de investigación. Margarita destacó la necesidad de promover el apoyo material, que ella fue la primera que en este simposio nos llevó por ese camino, el apoyo material de alcanzar una política de compromiso y así como ser el tema de transacciones financieras y bancarias hacia Cuba, cómo destrabar estos elementos. Valerie abordó muy francamente y directamente las posibilidades de cooperar en temas marinos, como ya había señalado también Patricia, el cambio climático, las artes y tradiciones de pesca, contaminación, gas, petróleo y el trabajo con aspectos migratorios. Ya en la tarde, los miembros del American College of Environmental Lawyers presentaron el trabajo de su organización, y Pamela centró todo su trabajo en el impacto del cambio climático en la agricultura. Una presentación muy importante porque nos enfocaba en el interés de colaborar con Cuba y la necesidad de traducir aspiraciones en acciones que tengan un impacto en las legislaciones y políticas, que eso tiene que ver también muchas de las propuestas que ha habido en todo el simposio de tomar acciones que tengan impacto en las legislaciones y en las políticas. La presentación de Job Bastian desde su visión antropológica fue muy importante y en todas las diferentes visiones históricas, ambientales y económicas que se fueron dando en las presentaciones, y explicó el contexto socioeconómico en que se desarrolla la sociedad cubana para todos nosotros, y lo contrastó con la situación que se enfrenta a partir del 2020. Esta visión antropológica ha sido importante asumirla y será más importante en el futuro cuando ya estén habitando todos los elementos que hemos estado conversando aquí y que tengamos que enfrentar los dos caminos de cooperación por el desarrollo sustentable y encontrar soluciones a la cooperación en el desarrollo sustentable. Hope nos encaminó también los diferentes temas de actividad económica, problemas como la sobrepesca y la necesidad de desarrollar una pesquería sostenible, como ya lo había señalado también Valerie, Patricia y también la propia Margarita. Korey abordó el tema energético, la distribución energética en Cuba, que es un tema importante. Todas las propuestas había sido en la mañana también enfocado por Orlando Rey, lo que Cuba se propone para el 2030, que es una meta importante, pero que hay que continuarla y tiene que ser más amplia a diferentes sectores de la sociedad. Jordan nos llevó a una visión del papel de los instrumentos jurídicos, que muchas veces no los utilizamos o no los utilizamos en toda su potencialidad, en la promoción de la cooperación internacional y todo lo que tenemos que tener en cuenta antes y durante, antes de firmar un memorándum de entendimiento y durante su ejecución. Fue una ponencia esclarecedora para todos nosotros y nos lleva por el camino para hacer que se cumplan de manera eficaz los memorándum de entendimiento y para lograr también hacer herramientas legales que sean más sólidas en el futuro. Ya Daimar, casi al cierre del panel, nos enfocó sobre los problemas ambientales que no pueden ser tratados unilateralmente y cómo deben ser también enfocados por las administraciones públicas a nivel local. Fue la primera ponencia que nos guió la importancia de interrelacionarnos entre las administraciones públicas de ambos países, entre regiones de ambos países, como hemos venido haciendo, y ponía ejemplo de eso Liliana en la mañana en su presentación, y todos los elementos también que podemos colaborar en los temas de biodiversidad para proteger la diversidad biológica y que es necesario e imperativo reforzar los sistemas de vigilancia que reforzar los sistemas de vigilancia ofrece una oportunidad muy grande para la cooperación. Y bueno, específicamente Yociel, que soy yo, ya al final le fue presentando la idea, que es un poco, que engloba este simposio, de la necesidad de poner en práctica acciones, fundamentos por un desarrollo sostenible, buscando soluciones y donde lo fundamental sea la protección de los recursos naturales y en las relaciones bilaterales y la formación de capacidades por un lado y la ejecución de proyectos. Tenemos que llevar de forma paralela formar capacidades y por la otra ejecutar proyectos prácticos por el bien común de toda la región. Creo que en el corto periodo de tiempo posible tratado de sumarizar este simposio y bueno, David, Dan, creo que darle la palabra a Margaret. Si no hay preguntas por responder, si no hay un comentario de otro panelista o incluso quedaría un minuto para si hay de la audiencia alguien que quiera hacer una pregunta o aportar una recomendación, sería el momento ahora.
Yociel?
Yes, sí.
Andrea Panelists had a comment that she asked us to read.
I think there had been one comment that had been put in the chat room.
I would like to give the floor to Andrea Panariti.
She left a comment in the chat, and please, Meg, if you want to read it.
Yes, she asked us to read it for her. And that is, historically, environmental concerns have been one area that have been able to lead and point out common objectives on both sides of the straits. This has allowed policy at times to overcome politics, focusing on the win-win environmental work, which is so important, especially in the face of dire climate unraveling. End of her comment.
Well stated.
Yes, very definitely. And if there are no other questions or comments, I will move to the critically important realm of a little bit of follow-up and a lot more thank yous. So if there are no questions, etc., then I'll move ahead. Pamela asked about putting together a compendium of projects on Cuba. This has been attempted by a number of institutions, including the Social Science Research Council, with Ford funding, amongst others. And it's been very difficult to do, in part because of the great number of such projects, etc. But if you contact Sarah Doty at the Social Science Research Council, she could probably tell you the current status of that initiative. I want to, on behalf of Columbia University, thank Dan Whittle of the Environmental Defense Fund, David Ferrer of the American College of Environmental Lawyers, and Liliana Nuñez Vélez and Yociel Marerro, as well as their colleagues from the Fundación Antonio Nuñez Jiménez, etc. Special thank yous go, of course, to the translators who have had many challenges today, but they have clearly dealt with them expeditiously. And of course, there's another special thank you to Gretchen Sanchez Higueras, who has been our technical expert and who always has been willing and able to resolve problems that crop up, etc. And so we want to give her a special thank you. And finally, we want to thank all of the people who linked in order to participate in this conference. It was an enormous undertaking. It's been a very rewarding undertaking, particularly today when all of the expertise in Cuba and the United States was brought together, etc. In terms of recommendations, we will go through the summary of the actual presentations and comments, and anyone who wants to send us a recommendation or additional information, you can send it to Gretchen and we will be delighted to have it. And a final thank you goes to the Institute for Latin American Studies, who together with myself paid for this event. Thank you all.
Thank you, and Gretchen was marvelous.
She always is, she always is.
Can I jump in here and say a couple thanks?
Sure.
So real quick, thank you, Meg and Gretchen. I mean, it was incredible work putting this together, and to David, Yociel, Liliana, and everyone else who made this a reality. I think Yociel, you get credit for really thinking of it and convincing all of us to do it. So thank you for that. You know, I just want to say a couple things in terms of priorities, in terms of collaboration. In 2015, when the world changed, you know, everyone and their brother, you know, suddenly wanted to work in Cuba, and that was great. There was a huge amount of interest, and more than our Cuban partners could actually accept. So I think looking forward, if we're successful in convincing the two governments to talk to each other, if we're successful in convincing the Biden administration to have better policy on Cuba, I think it's really important to focus on the priorities of our Cuban friends and counterparts, and really help them, support them in doing what they're already doing. And what I heard today, that's clean energy, it's clean water, it's public health, it's food security through sustainable fisheries and sustainable agriculture, it's jobs through all of the above, it's resilience to climate change, which affects every aspect of life in Cuba, and it's sustainable development. So I think the more that those of us who've been working in Cuba for a long time can help harness additional resources, private, public, and academic sectors in the US to focus on those priorities. So it's not just a big stampede. You know, I think that's great. Also, I think we should do everything we can to facilitate two-way travel. We're really missing having our Cuban colleagues here to help us think about some of our serious issues like response to hurricanes and adapting to climate change, et cetera. So I just want to put it in a plug for that. There are 1,000 things we can do, but let's just, yeah, let's work together.
That's great, Dan. It's David. I can't tell you how wonderful it's been to be with all of you. I thank everybody Again, Meg and Gretchen for all the support. Yes, the translator's amazing. Co-sponsors and this amazing faculty. It's just been, I can't tell you what a pleasure it has been, professionally, socially, to be with all of you today. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's just Dan gave me the credits just to put everybody together, but the credits for everybody, and it's not on face modest. It's really have been met you some years ago, met Margaret and Dan and David. It's like everything have been a contribution to really do that and share with all the audience and the other panelists. Thanks to be here. Thanks to really continue thinking on Cuba and the relation in the future of our two peoples. And Gretchen, big job. Have been connected. I think that all her family want to finish. All our family want to really stop a little bit and continue now in the in publics all the result of that. And thank you, everybody. Really.
Thank you all.
Next year in Cuba, we're going to be there in person.
Very good idea.
We hope. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.